systems. But yet, arguably, an understudied aspect of this field is book diplomacy. And to address this gap, or to address this topic, we have brought together three renowned researchers who have done research on book diplomacy in both the East and West blocks. And first, we will hear Andrés Sánchez, who is professor at the Carlos III University of Madrid. Then Pablo León, tenure track researcher here, the National Research Council, will share his insights with us. And finally, Rósa Magnúsdóttir, professor of the University of Iceland, will close our seminar. And each of our guest speakers will have approximately 30-35 minutes for their presentations, in order to allow us to reserve some time for questions, comments, and debate at the end of the seminar. And that's it. Also, you are all very welcomed to the guided visit to the exhibition, which is in the hall of the building. The exhibition that we have also coordinated together. And we have this very attractive title that Fly Me to the Moon, Spain, US, and the space race during the Cold War. So without further delay, allow me to introduce our first speaker, Andrés Sánchez. He teaches modern history at Carlos III University of Madrid. He has previously held teaching positions at several universities and has been a visiting scholar at Georgetown University and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He specializes in the history of US foreign policy in the 19th and 20th centuries, and his work has appeared in leading peer-reviewed journals in Europe and the Americas, including the International History Review, American 19th Century History, Historia Crítica, and Historia Política, among others. So, Andrés, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Óscar. I must say I'm a bit intimidated to be in the presence of real experts in book diplomacy, and because for me it's still a new field of research, although I've been working on this for a few years, especially with Pablo, with Professor León. And I hope my comments today are taken as just a provisional position that hopes to be enhanced by your feedback. Book diplomacy and the Cold War, as Óscar has said, is still, I think, an understudied field. And my position, Pablo will talk more about that, has been also peripheral in this field of study, in the sense that Pablo and me have been studying more the, you could say, the North-South dimension of book diplomacy. So when we talk about book diplomacy, at least I say that the historiography has particularly focused on conflict as the defining, one of the defining dimensions of book diplomacy. That is, in particular, although scholars, especially again, when it comes to the Western Hemisphere, have spoken about the early 20th century, even sometimes late 19th century, as precedents of what we would call book diplomacy, but in particular is the world wars that has both the first and particularly the Second World War that have been so far considered the origins of what we would call book diplomacy. As I said, there are precedents, especially when we think about, some scholars have pointed out that European powers already in the era of imperialism devoted resources to the creation of libraries in the context of cultural diplomacy. But nothing systematic until particularly World War II. So again, the focus has been very much on the use of books in that conflict as weapons, as basically propaganda. And in particular, the contrast has been drawn between in particular, the idea of the Axis powers as powers that destroy books, destroy culture, in contrast to what the Allies, and in particular the United States, did in the distribution of books. This also speaks to what has been called book hunger, the idea that there was a lack of, in relation to the conflict, the idea that there was a lack of books in the material sense, the idea, in other words, that the Axis or fascism have been more influential because they had had a better distribution of their ideas, and therefore what was needed was a campaign of distribution of healthy, democratic book materials. So that's I had to add that was also in relation to the role of the state. So another focus has been on the state-corporate alliance, or the public-private partnership that was established in World War II between the US government in particular and the US publishing industry. Advancing, therefore, not just political or ideological goals, but also economic goals. That is, in the case of the US publishing industry, the displacement of the hegemony of European publishing industries that had been dominant in book markets until World War II. So that alliance, therefore, has been considered an important part. This, in other words, this goes back to the notion that to understand US foreign policy, you have to take into account ideology, of course, and geopolitics, but also economics, in the sense of the economic interests of certain sectors and the development of global capitalism. When we move to the Cold War, again, book diplomacy has been seen in general as another part of cultural. Book diplomacy has been seen as another part of cultural diplomacy in general, and therefore the debates had been the same as in other areas of cultural diplomacy. And we see that in terms of the first, one of the main debates has been this so-called transition between so-called culturalist or cultural approach, usually associated with books, as therefore opposed to a more informational or propagandistic approach, in the sense of understanding books as, shall we say, slow media or long-term cultural exchange of ideas, and therefore a kind of more less suspect, more free exchange, in opposition to the increasingly dominant informational approach in US cultural diplomacy, in which books are not so important because they are not so effective in conveying the messages, the propaganda, the truth about the United States that US administrations were increasingly seeking. And therefore, this has led to the interpretation that books didn't play such an important part in the Cold War in terms of the battle for the hearts and minds of different populations, because also books are something that was consumed mostly by elites. They require high education, or they require a more sophisticated educational background, and therefore they are more effective with elites, and they are not a mass, shall we say, a mass consumption product. However, the fact of the matter is that, as scholars have repeatedly pointed out, you have a variety of programs, especially in the United States, throughout the Cold War related to books. So they don't disappear. In fact, some programs have continued to this day. This is just a selection because there are more. And one of the problems had been to actually make sense of this variety of programs. What was their purpose? And something that I'd say most scholars would agree to is that they reflect in part the oscillations, the erratic shifts in US foreign policy when it came to culture in the Cold War, in which you had, therefore, programs created at different points for different purposes, and sometimes contradicting themselves, and sometimes working in opposition and working against each other. That's particularly the case when programs were carried out by different agencies. So in particular, in our research, we have found a lot of rivalry between USAID and USIA. So unfortunately, we don't have time to delve into all of these programs, but one thing that has been clear as well is the lack of a comparable research effort for the main, apparently the main rival of the United States in book diplomacy during the Cold War, which was the Soviet Union. So again, I'm not an expert in Soviet book diplomacy, but scholars have pointed out that some problems exist, and the lack of available sources, as well as the different outlook that, in general, Soviet book diplomacy had. This, I think, points to something that I will mention later, which is that when we talk about book diplomacy, we are not just, I think, talking about foreign policy or the foreign policy apparatuses of the two superpowers, but also different, completely opposing economic systems. So Soviet book diplomacy, of course, was not based on any kind of public-private partnership or state-corporate alliance, as was the case with the United States, and therefore didn't, shall we say, play by the same rules. With that said, it's clear, or apparently American sources thought that, especially in the 50s and 60s, that Soviet book diplomacy was more successful in terms of distribution, in terms of the availability of cheap books, and that in turn, at least in Latin America, led to the idea of the so-called book gap, the idea that making an analogy with the so-called missile gap, the Soviets were getting ahead also in the distribution of books, and by distributing more books, were also getting ahead in spreading communist or Marxist ideas. That, I think, that's why I brought this ranking of authors, in which you can see that Marx and Lenin are prominent, also Gorky and Russian authors like Chekhov are prominent among the most read authors in those times. Of course, these rankings, I think, should always be taken with a grain of salt, as most statistics, because obviously there are problems with all these aggregate statistics, but also I think, and American sources certainly point out that distribution is not equal to reading, and also reading is not equal to actual influence, and that leads to that will lead to impact that I will discuss later. So, in addition to what I have said, I think an important trend in the last few years has been what I call a renewed focus on materiality when it comes to book diplomacy. The idea that as important as messages, ideas, and what kinds of titles are distributed, the focus should also take into account print and material basis for the distribution of programs. And in that sense, so authors like Greg Barnesel had pointed out that by focusing on actual institutional programs, we can see that an important element is the debate in the United States between what was called middlebrow and highbrow culture. So the idea that although traditionally books were seen as part of this kind of high culture, much like classical music or even painting, the Americans, at least in the 1950s, were pursuing a different approach, an approach based on the idea that books could be mass cultural products. That would be the idea that Middlebrough conveys the idea that books could be considered mass cultural products and not so much high culture. And that related to the notion of somehow Cold War modernism. Modernism as this movement, particularly associated with literature, but that precedes the Cold War. When you think about authors like William Faulkner, for instance, their most important books were in the 1920s and 1930s, Hemingway as well, among others. But this movement, as a movement that could be weaponized in the Cold War to promote this notion of not just Middlebrough culture, but this notion of an autonomous culture. The idea that the autonomy of the artists is something that can only happen in free capitalist societies, as opposed to the government-led kind of art and culture that was produced in the communist bloc. And I would say that they have, although I think this aspect is still underdeveloped, they had also pointed to the importance of the commercialization of books in the Cold War, in particular to the idea that there was a paperback revolution, meaning that is in the Cold War when you see the spread of or the displacement of traditional hardback books by paperback editions that were obviously cheaper and that were much more commercial in outlook. And this is related to the notion of the bestseller and therefore in a way you could say the commodification of book culture associated as well to the rise of, or to the hegemony already mentioned of the U.S. publishing industry in during the Cold War. In the last few years, I'd say that a lot of attention has been devoted to East-West relations, in particular to the Eastern Bloc and U.S. book diplomacy in East European countries, in the Soviet Union. There are more books on this. This is just 2 examples of that. But I think that's something that is, at least in my opinion, becoming more and more fashionable in the last few years. One reason for that, I think, is again that this in particular is something associated. This shall we call Iron Curtain studies are associated with the CIA and not so much with US IA. And obviously, the role of the CIA is always, I think, something that attracts more attention. The notion that is something covert as opposed to more overt operations. Although I'd say that the limits between overt and covert operations are blurry in many areas, certainly in Latin America. And there is no, I think, such a clear distinction. But I think the other reason is that in the case of the Iron Curtain, in the case of Eastern Europe, I think there is a perception that you can actually see a successful operation, and that actually at least implicitly, there has been an idea that book diplomacy work in Eastern Europe, because the assumption has been book diplomacy work because communism collapsed in Eastern Europe, and therefore these book programs did really produce a successful result. Obviously, I think there's a problem with that, in the sense that I think it's very difficult to establish impact when it comes to book diplomacy, because obviously that something happened after the fact doesn't mean that that was the cause. But this, I think, is a problem with book diplomacy in general. The evidence is always fragmentary. It's very, very difficult to establish really a causal mechanism, saying that clearly, establishing without a doubt that because certain people read certain books, they then took certain decisions. And because that is so difficult to establish, other authors like, for instance, Michael Crane, have argued that the study of book diplomacy, the study of cultural diplomacy in general, and that includes book diplomacy, should not focus so much on impact, and should pay attention to things like intentions, expectations, in particular, in the case of the United States, or and that could be applied to the Soviet Union as well. What these diplomats or Cold Warriors expected these book programs to actually achieve. Whether they achieve that or not, which is more difficult to establish, but what was their intention, because that would reveal many things about their outlook, about their view of the world, which are inherently valuable historical objects of study. To finish my talk, I think I still have time. I want to suggest some ideas as ways forward that are already being sometimes applied, but I think should bear some fruits in the future, and in particular things that I'm interested in pursuing. Usually, in the case of the United States, on many occasions, the US approach has been described as this idea, this focus on the so-called free flow of information as something characteristic of the United States. But as I have seen, and as I have mentioned today, we see everywhere that state corporates, alliances, public-private partnerships were established. Therefore, perhaps this notion of the free flow of information should not be taken for granted as at face value, in the sense that someone like Sam Lebovich has pointed out, it's in many ways, or could be considered as a kind of smokescreen, in the sense that in a free market economy like the US economy and other, and certainly in the case of the Western countries, when it comes to the book diplomacy and the book industry, certainly there was, or it's very doubtful that there was ever a free flow of information, in the sense that there is state intervention all the time. And the US government was very keen, certainly, on supporting the US publishing industry. and certainly supporting certain publishers and not helping others. So perhaps I suggest we should also focus on what some historians have called this kind of military intellectual complex, in reference to the more famous military industrial complex, as these kind of institutions, and not just obviously the most obvious ones that have been already studied, like government agencies, like obviously the USIA, the CIA, but also these not exactly state institutions, but parastatal institutions. In particular, I suggest universities. I think there has been some studies about the role of university programs, but I think we should pay more attention to what some scholars have called the Cold War university, because universities in the United States were very much changed by the Cold War, and what we usually take for granted as the US university system was in many ways a Cold War product. A product that is, I should say, or a system that I think is now ending, and we're transitioning very quickly to a different kind of university system that I'm not sure how to characterize. But I think the Cold War university system is ending, and I think that we see that this university system, although again supposedly autonomous, was very much related to government funding and promoted all kinds of objectives. Certainly in the case of I think you see more clearly in the case of Latin America the importance of US universities for US book diplomacy. And another focus that I think should be important is the media ecosystem. Some scholars have already paid attention to magazines, to journals, but I think we should pay attention to the big picture, the entire media ecosystem, such because again, the notion of a free market place of ideas, I think, should never be taken for granted, neither in the Eastern Bloc, that I think is obvious, but also not in the Western Bloc. And my final point would be to, I think, instead, in addition to the East-West conflict, I think what you clearly see, at least in Latin America, but I think in other places as well, is the importance of the North-South axis of conflict. And I would suggest that we can gain a lot of insight by focusing, by also paying attention to supposedly non-ideological programs. And in particular, I'm particularly interested in technical book programs that are very prominent in the Western Hemisphere, and in which it's interesting because in these programs, at least certainly in the case of Latin America, books are seen as technology transfer. And I think that's a very insightful approach to see, because it combines this notion of materiality, but also it's related to the history of technology, the history of knowledge regulation. And I think in the case of technical book programs in Latin America, you see also a clear connection with the history of development. And that relates, of course, I think to, in particular, what many historians have called the role of American social science in the Cold War, as also part of the history of development and also of the history of U.S. cultural diplomacy, the promotion in particular of, or the emphasis on social science in the United States, in particular economics, as the most important and most influential social science, in particular because economists were not just social scientists, as we know, but in many cases were part of the government apparatus, were economic advisors to successive U.S. administrations, were part of the, therefore, of the federal government, and had a direct influence. Here you really can see a causal mechanism have a direct influence on specific policies pursued by the U.S. government. But more broadly, the spread of American social science as opposed to what I have called the Soviet focus on STEM, on science, technology, and I think we can gain many insights by playing with those notions of science and technology as opposed to social science in the Cold War. Of course, that was never something exclusive. Obviously, there was promotion of science and technology on the US side too. But I think this idea of social science versus hard science or STEM, I think is something that is worth considering, and that I suggest could be a way forward. That's, for me, I think that's enough. I left the floor to Óscar.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Andrés, for this thought-provoking discussion on book diplomacy. And now we move on to our second speaker, Pablo León. He's a tenured researcher here at the Institute of History, and his research has explored several layers of the global projection of the United States in the 20th century, including cultural trade and transfers, propaganda and public diplomacy, military assistance, and more recently, financial and commercial networks. He has published in journals like the International History Review, Ayer, and Cold War History. And his next book will be Philip W. Bonsall, Diario de un diplomático norteamericano en España, Estados Unidos entre la dictadura franquista, which is going to be published by Prensas de la Universidad de Zaragoza. So I hand over, Pablo.
Thank you, Óscar, for your nice words. And thank you, Andrés, for your insightful state of the field, which I think it introduces perfectly an area which is very active recently, and I think has many interesting paths of research for colleagues around the globe. My focus is going to be a little bit different than Andrés. I'm going to basically present you the results of a finished case study. We just got accepted an article on the Journal of Cold War Studies a few months ago. Who knows when will it get published? But this that I'm going to present is basically some of the major results. So Andrés and I wrote this article together, and we were able to finish this research, which it was started like long ago in the archives in the United States, thanks to una ayuda de incorporación de científicos titulares del CSIC. So I just wanted to mention that. Very important for my research, as always, is going to the archives. I learned that from my first days as a graduate student, and especially for 20th century international historians. And actually, this the information that led to this article, which is entitled Paperback Alliance, U.S. Book Diplomacy in Cold War Latin America, a Spanish Publisher and the Alboreal Collection. I got access to that through a Freedom of Information Act request. The first one I was ever accepted by the U.S. government, and that opened the boxes of Plaza y Janés, the publisher, deals with the U.S. Information Agency. So that was a kind of treasure that I had long wanted to explode, and finally, thanks to cooperation with Andrés, I've been able to do that. Also, for this article, we have researched U.S. Information Agency and Department of State records from several presidential libraries. Also, the records of John Knopf, one of the major publishers in the United States, which are held at the University of Texas. Knopf, as most other American publishers, cooperated with U.S. book diplomacy abroad. So they had those papers are very insightful for understanding the not only relations with the Spanish publishers, but also how the relationship between the American publish industry and the U.S. government worked during the Cold War. Also, we have used materials from the Archivo General de la Administración, mainly related to the Instituto Nacional del Libro papers. And finally, also at the Archivo General de la Universidad de Navarra, we work on the personal collections of a couple of individuals connected to some Spanish private publishers, and one of them actually became ambassador to the United States in the 1960s, Antonio Garrigues. So those papers have been the base of what you are going to see here. And what you are going to see here is American response to the Castro scare. And suddenly, in 1959, American reports, U.S. Information Agency and State Department reports, fill in with terms like book gap, book of words in America, in Latin America. We are losing Latin American minds. But this starts in 1959. They hadn't really said much about Latin America's Cold War until 1959. And it is the surprising success of the Cuban Revolution that actually makes American cultural Cold Warriors realize that they have to do something, or maybe that what they have been doing before hasn't worked, because U.S. cultural diplomacy or book diplomacy in Latin America didn't start in 1959. Actually, American cultural diplomacy and book diplomacy started in Latin America back in the 1920s and 1930s. But back then, it was more like cultural relations, spirit of communality, that was transforming as World War II came front and center, and American attitude, the perspective of American cultural diplomacy started to change a little bit. But at that time, we already had the cooperation of American propaganda warriors with Latin American publishers like Fondo de Cultura Económica, the most prestigious Latin American, and mostly known for left-wing publishing in the Cold War. But back in the 30s, when it was created, they cooperated with American propaganda in Latin America, and there are many other cases. As the cultural Cold War started, the Americans didn't really pay much attention to Latin America. They were focused, of course, in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and then East Asia, and well, Latin America was there. They were doing some programs, but didn't really spend much money. I mean, we have the information, we have the data. The amount of money they pour into Latin America was insignificant compared to what they were doing in other places, but they were doing some things. And they were also trying to replicate mainly what they had, their strategy for Europe to Latin America. And that was their original sin. replicating this recycling of Cold War North Atlantic ideological tropes and messages for a different kind of public. And that's going to be a big issue for American cultural cold warriors in Latin America ever since. And it's interesting to see that they won't be able to change on time. And this speaks volumes of the mentalities of American cultural cold warriors. And actually, they had examples that wasn't working. And one of the best known research examples is the failure of CIA's covert cultural operation in Latin America. Cuadernos del Congreso para la Libertad de la Cultura was a failure almost from start to the end in Latin America, in part because it relied too much on Spanish exiles who had this very 1930s anti-communist mentality, which didn't really resonate with Latin Americans. But it's interesting that the U.S. Information Agency also had its own book programs. And the most ambitious one was called Editorial Agora. They created a publisher at the U.S. Information Post in Buenos Aires, and which would publish dozens of volumes, which from 1954 to 1960s. It was going to be a huge failure. Most of the books they published actually were never distributed. I mean, later reports said that the ghost of warehouse in Buenos Aires of unsold copies of U.S. Information Agency subsidized books were still pursuing and American diplomats. I mean, they had spent quite a lot of money, and almost none of those books were ever distributed. And why? Well, and this is also very important to understand, the diagnosis they made. The diagnosis was not that we had picked the wrong titles, the wrong thematic orientation. No, the diagnosis was we've made technical mistakes. We didn't hire professional distribution and logistics. We weren't able to commercialize these books. That's the reason they failed, not because they weren't the right books for the Latin American targets. And this is very important because when you have a problem of reaching a market, well, then you search for partners who have the expertise, and who had that expertise in the late 50s available for cooperating with American cultural warriors in Latin America. Well, you had the Argentine and Mexican book industries, which were strong, but you also had the Spanish book industry, which had done a huge comeback in Latin American markets in the 1950s, like as Maria Fernandez Moya has shown us in her research. So we can see that the American documentation tells us that from 1959 to 1962, there is within the U.S. Information Agency a big debate about how to use the Spanish book industry in Latin America for our counteroffensive. We are going to do a cultural counteroffensive, and we need partners. For different reasons, they didn't really trust much the Argentine or the Mexican book publishers. So for some reason, they decided that the Spaniards could be good partners in this task, in this mission. One reason is that the Spanish companies had a huge, they had the knowledge, they had a good and proven record in distribution, in getting their books to almost every corner in Latin America, which, for instance, American publishers were not very interested in doing because of Latin America was not a very profitable market for them. For distinct reasons, the Spaniards were very active and had the proven record. They knew how to get their books to libraries throughout the continent, and that was what the American cultural cold warriors were looking for. Also, Castilian translations were considered neutral and prestigious in Latin America, or more neutral than other translations. So that also helped the image of Spanish book publishers like potential partners. Interestingly, censorship in Spain was never considered a major issue or problem. It had not been an issue for American propaganda in Spain. And that was another of the characteristics that explains why American Cold Warriors look for or look with thought well of Spanish of cooperation with the Spanish publishers, is that the Spanish book industry had been cooperating with American book diplomacy in Spain since at least 1952, which is when the book translation program was activated in Spain. And almost all the major Spanish publishers you can think of, Seix Barral, Aguilar, all of them had cooperated at some point with American book diplomacy. Basically, it was a good source of revenue for them. Translations, they had the knowledge. They knew the programs, they knew how they work. So, I mean, it was easy to establish a cooperation for Latin America. And also, they not only had the distribution networks, they had affiliates, they had this, special distributors in almost every country, but they also had contacts. Many of the Spanish publishers had either family or business contacts throughout Latin America because of the interconnection of the Spanish-speaking book industries, which has been already researched. Finally, the Franco regime did not discourage cooperation with U.S. propaganda. The government didn't say to Spanish publishers, do not cooperate with U.S. government programs in Latin America. There were issues, there was a small debate, but mostly Spanish private publishers had a free they were free to decide whether they wanted to cooperate or not. And many were going to try that cooperation. From 1960 through 1963, proposals from Spanish publishers started to pile up. Gredos, Aguilar, Reverte, Santillana, Hispano-Europea, Tecnos, Ariel. Interesting, only one major program would see the light, and that was Colección Alboreal by Plaza y Janés, which was not a well-established company. Actually, it had just been created in 1959 by the combination of Plaza and Janés collections. The Plaza brothers were like the motor behind the company, one based in Barcelona, the other one in Buenos Aires. And also Ignacio San Pedro in Montevideo played an important role too. Plaza, as many other Spanish publishers, had affiliates in the most important Latin American book markets like Mexico and Argentina, but in the case of Plaza also in Uruguay. And then they had agreements with distributors in most other countries. So they had the network. They could offer that network to American cultural warriors. Also, Plaza was, from its very beginning, specialized in translations of literary bestsellers, Pulitzer Prizes. We can see 1960 collection by Plaza on Pulitzer Prizes. And this was before cooperating with American book programs. So they had the knowledge, they had the network, they had the interest, and they were also considered at the time to be very aggressive in commercial and marketing policies. And they were also considered one of the companies that was more aggressive with paperbacks, which was the form that American Cold Warriors preferred at the time. So also we have to add their aggressive courting by Plaza of American interest. And you can see this, for instance, when the 15th International Book Publisher Association took place in Barcelona in May 1962. It speaks volumes that the International Association of Book Publishers was taking place in Barcelona, Spain, because Barcelona, of course, was the the central city of the Spanish book industry, and also because Spain was by the time the most important center for book publishing in the world. So so Plaza got what the others didn't, and that was U.S. Information Agency approval of their proposal. It was only one collection, but what a collection. The project was 4 million volumes, 25,000 copies minimum each of every one of the 164 titles, divided in 4 categories that replicated those of an earlier proposal: Encyclopedia Popular Ilustrada, biography, literature, politics, and science. An estimated cost per year of $740,000 per year, which was quite a lot of money at the time. 5 years span, 1963 through 1967. The paperbacks, which were subsidized by the USIA, were to be sold at low retail prices, and they were aimed at a mass audience. And what the USIA wanted was widespread distribution throughout Latin America. Plaza y Janés Buenos Aires was going to be in charge. Plaza y Janés Buenos Aires was 50% owned by Plaza y Janés Barcelona. They would be in charge of distribution and marketing, radio campaigns, sales, promotion, etc. But, and this is important, U.S. Information Agency would retain control of title selection and ideological orientation of the program. Plaza had the ability to choose among the list provided by the USA Information Agency, but they didn't have the ability to actually change course, propagandistically speaking, with the program. But it was a great, it was a safe bet for Plaza y Janés. Why? Because of the subsidizing systems. They were basically assured benefit, minimum benefit per copy. So they were assured, like, with, I think it is, we got this from the documentation. It was like between 11 and 20 cents per book sold. That was assured benefit assured profit for the company. Although we don't have enough information to really know how much they earn. And Plaza y Janés archive exists at the Biblioteca Nacional de Cataluña, but they don't have the papers of the Buenos Aires Post. So we don't really have all the required information to really know how much they earned. Though it seems they made a good profit, at least that's what the American Cultural Cold Warriors were saying. And they didn't. American Cold Warriors didn't do a good profit, and that was their own conclusion. The program was 4 million copies. Well, of those 4 million, only half were eventually published. In this occasion, most were distributed, although a third were not. That is more than 600,000 books that were never distributed. So that was total loss from the economic and propagandistic point of view. But also other problems. Most of the books that were commercialized were sold in Argentina. So what it had been thought as a program for Latin America, it ended up being a program mostly for Argentina, which is, of course, where Plaza y Janés had a stronger network. So they had to do, they had sold themselves very well to the U.S. Information Agency, but they really didn't deliver in most of their promises to American Cold Warriors. Of course, they were making a profit anyway. So, but Plaza's savvy ways were created even more headaches for American Cold Warriors. They had conflicts with American copyright holders, with local distributors. Well, at one point, the American Cold Warriors requested an audit, which Pricewaterhouse did in 1965. They didn't find like outright wrongdoing or insolvency, but the trust was gone by 1965. Also, commercialization and block, which is the way that most books were sold by Plaza, door to door in Argentina, but in set species of 20, 30, or even 50 books. Well, what USIA experts or what the USIA analyzed internally is that those books tended to not be read at all. So, okay, you were selling a lot of books, but most people were reading maybe 1, 2, and stopped reading them like after 2, 3, 4 weeks, or after 1, 2, 3 books. So that was the real problem. And why people stopped reading the books? Because they were not interesting, basically. I mean, they were not good books for the target, right? For the target. The low popularity was evinced by USA Information Agency's own surveys. They did a very ambitious and huge survey of the Argentine readers of the collection, and the findings were a bit pessimistic. This is not working. Basically, that's what it said, for several reasons. Some I have already mentioned. Most readers didn't have a particularly favorable opinion. More books, as usual, were sold than read, etc., etc., etc. The Agora ghost, right? And the ghost of the past. The American Cold Warriors hadn't changed their approach. They were not trusting the right local allies. They were not engaging with what Latin American readers were looking for. Simply, the books didn't really speak to the readers, and that was a huge problem. Of course, you can sell the book, but if it is not interesting, if it doesn't catch the attention of the reader, what's the point? And again, same problems that with Agora in the 50s. Most Cold War-related titles, for instance, dealt with the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, even with U.S. intervention in Vietnam, but none with the Dominican Republic in 1965. There were almost no books dealing with North-South relations or Latin American regional issues. There was only one book on Cuba, which was surprising. Another one on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and 2 more on foreign aid in foreign relations. 4 titles of 164. What were most books about? Well, they were mostly about promoting a good image of the United States, culturally, socioeconomically, technoscientifically. But even some of those books were counterproductive, like ¿Por qué es rico Estados Unidos? I mean, and that one I had it in my hands some weeks ago. I couldn't keep it, sorry. But those kind of books weren't able to really reach a big audience. The most popular books of the collections were mostly Kennedy related, and I guess it has to do with the assassination and the aura around him. But books didn't sell well. Even those on the space race didn't do particularly well. There was also only one book, dealing with the Spanish-speaking population of the United States, which was not large at the time, but they had Puerto Rico, of course, and that one book was on a Puerto Rican poet, Luis Muñoz Martín. But that was the problem, that the books didn't really speak to the needs and to the mores and dreams of the Latin American population. So they were missing also the target. supposedly they wanted to reach middle, lower classes, but in the end, most books were read by the elites, the professional elites in Argentina, and that's the data from the U.S. Information Agency's own surveys. So this explains that by 1966, it was an easy decision to finalize to kill the program. It was not the only program that was cut at the time, because that was the same year, 1966, 1967, when the scandal on CIA secret funding of cultural programs broke out in the United States. So it was a time when the U.S. government, the Johnson administration, had to reconsider its cultural strategy. So I'm going to leave it here. I think we have enough for debate afterwards, and nothing more. Thank you, Óscar.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you very much, Pablo. That was a very interesting presentation. And the final presentation of this morning will be given by Rósa Magnúsdóttir.
Can kiss it.
Oh. Can you share it? Or?
Full screen, yeah, here, right here. Okay. Now.
As I said, the last presentation of this morning is going to be given by Rósa Magnúsdóttir. She is professor at the University of Iceland, and she holds a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and taught for 15 years at Aarhus University in Denmark. I met her for the first time there, and before moving to Iceland in 2021. She's the author of the book Enemy Number One, The United States of America in Soviet Ideology and Propaganda, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. And she has also published a number of articles on Soviet American cultural relations, the cultural Cold War, and communist lives. She's currently working on Soviet American book diplomacy together with Birgit Beck-Priested, as well as writing several articles on the cultural Cold War in Iceland, focusing on topics such as female activism, effects on nuclear radiation, and Cold War propaganda. And Rósa, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Óscar, for inviting me. This is my very first time in Madrid. I'm very happy to be here. And this is better weather than we have in the summer in Iceland. The average, I mean, we're happy if it goes like up to 16 or 17 degrees. So this is very nice. And it's really valuable for me to listen to your presentations. And I look forward to the article coming out. Congratulations. That's really, really awesome. So, yeah, and I was really impressed that Óscar could, invite me and then put together an event like that is so relevant for my own research interest. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I came to it, and then go over some of the conclusions that me and Birgitte have reached. Because as Óscar mentioned, I do all of this research on book diplomacy together with a colleague, Birgitte Beck-Priested, who's at Aarhus University. And she has a background in Russian literature and cultural studies. And this is the cover of a book that she wrote about the new Russian book, A Graphic Cultural History is the subtitle. And as I progress with the presentation, you will also see maybe how our two interests sort of are combined, because I come to this project from a focus on cultural on the cultural Cold War, cultural relations, cultural exchanges, and cultural diplomacy. The book, Enemy Number One, focused on U.S., sort of on the perception of the U.S. in Soviet ideology and propaganda from 1945 to 1959. And I was also very, always focusing very much on agency, trying to sort of understand what people thought of the US, which is very difficult to do in a totalitarian society. And then I wrote this a biography of a married couple who were both Stalinists until they died in the 1970s and 1980s, which is quite a remarkable story. And it's very related to all the work that I do, even the book diplomacy project, because this man that you see here was the main publisher in Iceland and received a lot of funding from the Soviet Union for publishing works in translation and Icelandic works. And I mean, there was definitely no shortage of Lenin in translation in Icelandic during the Cold War. So this is indeed an interdisciplinary project. Birgitte comes at it from the book history and sort of the book as a material object kind of way, which we heard a little bit about as well in the first presentation. And I come at it from maybe the perspective of what is sometimes now called the new diplomatic history. So together we're very happy that we could come up with this focus on book diplomacy. And the first publication, or this union between us, actually came about because Greg Barnesol, who was also mentioned in the first presentation, asked me to write an article about American books in the Soviet Union. He had read my book, he actually wrote the blurb for it, and then asked me for the contribution. And I went to Birgitte and said, could we do something about this? And then we started just brainstorming, and we found the sort of very intriguing space of the Moscow or the Soviet International Book Exhibits and Fairs. And that's how we started to dive in. And for both of us, this has been a really fun project. We decided to keep it as a project that we love to work on together. We haven't even applied for funding. We said instead of the time spent on writing applications, we'll just write articles. And so far, we have published 2 articles in these books, the Bloomsbury Handbook to Cold War Literary Cultures, and then a book that just came out in August, Book Diplomacy and the Cultural Cold War, edited by Ismail Haddadian Magatami and Giles Scott Smith. So this is the output so far. In the first article, we look at Soviet-American publishing relations and the Moscow book exhibitions in the late Cold War. Then we went in a little bit of a different direction, which also speaks to what you were saying about, the technocratic focus. We looked at the publication of the American popular science journal, Scientific American, in the Soviet Union in Russian translation, and focused on and actually found very interesting semi-diplomatic spaces of these Soviet American publishing relations. And then finally, and I'll tell you a little bit about it if I have time, we have an article forthcoming in Cahiers d'Histoire Russe about the publication and silent reception of the thornbirds in the Soviet Union. And some people might remember the Thornbirds. It was a global bestseller in the 1970s, and there was a television series that was very popular. I think many people of my generation remember sitting with their mothers on the couch while they were watching this. It's an Australian book, but is included in our study because the American publisher Harper and Row negotiated the rights to the Soviet Union. So this is the book diplomacy project so far, and it is continuing. And I will just tell you, I mean, we've heard a little bit about, the Soviet book market or Soviet book diplomacy being very difficult. But during the Cold War, book publishing in the Soviet Union was a state monopoly. So the State Committee for Publishing, or Gaskomistat, which is the acronym for it in Russian, was the instrument that negotiated with all governmental planning and supply authorities and determined how and always something that was politically approved. Publishing programs, what publishing programs would receive resources, and also through some inconsistent censorship, decided what titles would be available to Soviet readers. And in the last decades leading up to perestroika, the annual output of book titles stagnated in the Soviet Union. And this is when publishers are producing enormous print runs of official Soviet classics and textbooks, but increasingly educated urban readers are searching for foreign novelties in literary journals or black market copies. Because as you probably well know, the Soviet Union censored its own writers, and they blocked foreign literature and foreign authors from reaching the population. So they controlled and limited the availability of American and English language literature to these and quote-unquote book-hungry Soviet readers. So book hunger also becomes a term, although later in the Soviet contexts than in the European context. And since there is no shortage of research in the sort of Soviet Russian historical field on the illegal circulation of books and literature in the Soviet Union, that is what is often known as samizdat, or self-published, and the relationship of these kinds of literature works to the dissidence movement, also to the publication of underground Soviet literature abroad, that is known as tamizdat, that is published over there. Birgitte and I made this very important decision early on that we are focusing on legal publications. So it is about the book as an exchange and trade object. We also try to figure out, how the Soviets are then meeting as a desire for certain books in the Soviet Union. But we really focus on legal and sometimes semi-official, semi-legal publications in this extremely difficult environment controlled by the Soviet state publisher, Gazkamistad. So we see the superpower struggle in books, and there are always ideological considerations with a private market working on the one side, and then the planned economy in the Soviet Union. So apart from ideological consideration, there was always a huge economic imbalance between the two superpowers, which was also a matter of concern. And this is just a random number from, the early Cold War. In 1961, Soviet publishers were importing books worth a total of 423,000 rubles from the United States, but exported to the United States books worth only 290,000 rubles. And the Soviet state publishers did not have any marketing or advertising sections and operated completely outside of the profit and consumer demand criteria. And I'm just going to sort of go very briefly over some of the prehistory before I get to the late 1970s. There was a reorganization of the state publishing system in 1964, which is when Khrushchev is ousted from power. And the press committee under the Soviet Council of Ministers was now seeking to expand its efforts into organizing the display and propaganda of books from the Soviet Union and the socialist world at international book exhibitions for both domestic and foreign audiences. And there is an underlying story all the time also about the Soviet Union Soviet Union's need for hard currency. So the economic history is definitely always there as well. And we see the Cold War sort of international book market. The Soviets are also working to internationalize their own contributions to this growing book market. And there is kind of like a parallel history there with the Soviet Union joining UNESCO and the publication of the Courier being all of a sudden available to the Soviet Union. I wouldn't say that it had flowed in, but there were certain publications that by the Soviet Union joining became available. And in the 1960s, the International Publishers Association moved to Geneva to establish closer connections to UNESCO. And around the same time, American publishers start traveling to the Soviet Union on these organized tours. And the first delegation that is listed there, with the participation of the American Book Publishers Council and the American Textbook Publishers Institute, they stayed in the Soviet Union for 4 weeks, and the main goal, as was the goal of the IPA and the UNESCO and all these agencies were working towards this, was to get the Soviet authorities to accept the Geneva Universal Copyright Convention, the UCC. So from an American perspective, Soviet publications of Western literature, because they did have their own publications, published Western literature in translation, and of course only literature that matched the ideological concern for the needs of the Soviet state. But they were defined as a kind of state-authorized mass piracy, because the Soviet copyright law provided freedom of translation as long as the author of the original work was informed about the translation and the meaning and integrity of the work was conserved. So Soviet state publishers did not recognize world intellectual property rights, as they did not consider literary works to belong to the individual creators, but rather to the public and society as a whole. So Soviet state publishing authorities rarely chose to compensate Western writers, and when they did, it was in the form of soft currency or vouchers that these authors could only use during travels to the Soviet Union. And this created complications for many Western writers who, had denounced the Soviet Union at some point, be it after 1956 or 1968, but they had actual financial interests in going there and continuing to participate in the Soviet system. So these payments, they were issued to compensate them for the quote-unquote exploitation they were subject to in the capitalist system of publishing, and then also as a token of appreciation if the writers had written works that were either critical of a capitalist modernity or had portrayed the Soviet way of life positively. Some of these authors then later became very problematic for the Soviet Union because they then wrote books that, switched positions, and there are many stories of that in the local atmosphere. In 1970, then the Association of American Publishers, which had just been established, sent a second delegation to the Soviet Union. And I'm going to come back to the proceedings of these delegations. The Soviet Union was really working very hard through working with these delegations and the international organizations to improve its international image. And it was not just to further the politics of détente, but also to improve its economic development. And it was highly dependent on boosting knowledge, scientific and cultural exchanges with Western countries. So sort of following these delegations, and then in 1967, there was this one book, first international book exhibit in Moscow, which was put on to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. But in this sense, international was really just communist international. There were no Western publishers, but the Soviet-aligned socialist nations participated, and that was enough to give them the label of communist international. But it, of course, excluded China, North Korea, North Vietnam, all of whom had broken with the Soviet Union at the time. And here we see, especially with this sort of very internally looking slogan, the book is a leader of the idea of October, peace and progress, which is, of course, because it is to celebrate the October Revolution, which sort of has the echo of, books are weapons in the war of ideas, the motto of the American Books in Translation program in 1951. And then in 1972, Moscow hosted the UNESCO International Book Year Symposium. And that's one more of those parallel stories that is really interesting to look at, especially in 1972, when UNESCO has this international book year and puts a lot of pressure and, on relations with developing countries, all of different kinds of angles. But all of this leads to finally in 1973, the Soviet Union entering into a multilateral copyright agreement that included Western countries by joining the UCC, the Universal Copyright Convention. And this, is not, it's interesting because this is a really huge step for the copyright story of the Soviet Union. And it was not the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Trade that negotiated this with the UCC, but it was the Gazkamistat. It was, and we sort of constantly focus on the Soviet state publisher, Gazkamistat, as a way to show how important they were both in the Soviet structure and then in terms of the transatlantic, transnational dialogues that this institution had. And this sort of history of international book exhibitions and fairs shows that Soviet publishing authorities, and both Gazkamistat and then the All-Union Agency of Author Rights that was established as after the UCC agreement, they actively pursued an increased international book trade and on capitalist market conditions. And now they're aiming to increase the number of translation contracts with Western publishers. So the Soviet acceptance of the UCC increased the number of meetings between Soviet and American publishers, not only during the reciprocal delegation visits, but also during negotiations on neutral ground at the annual Frankfurt Book Fair. But then we see, the great power of the book was kind of what came out of these stories when that's from the 1970 International Book Exhibition in Moscow, which celebrated the 100th anniversary of Lenin's birthday. And this was more international than the 1967 International Book Exhibit. There were some small left-wing publishers from Anglophone countries, including the United States, the UK, India, and Canada. And that's when a pamphlet started calling the Soviet Union a great power of the book. And then we have the UNESCO International Book Year Symposium and finally the Universal Copyright Convention. All of this then leading to 1975 Helsinki Accords, which are really important and a turning point for the publishing relations because of the pressure that it put on the Soviet Union to encourage and support free flow of information. I mean, not that it, completely turned into that kind of an activity, but it was important. And we see the late 1970s book fairs in the Soviet Union sort of changing from the book as weapons metaphor. And you see now much more of a sort of book globe. It's in the imagery at the exhibit, like the book globe hanging from the ceiling, more focus on sort of these United Nations, UNESCO type of symbols, and of course, peace. But there is definitely a celebration of the both of the sort of goals of information exchange that had been sort of put forth in both the Soviet participation in UNESCO and then of course in the 1975 Helsinki Final Act. And since then, starting in 1975, the Committee of Soviet American Publishing Relations of the Association of American Publishers had been a driving force in establishing a copyright agreement with Soviet state publishers to foster the commercial book trade, while at the same time supporting Soviet dissident writers and human rights activists. And this is something that we saw and found very interesting in the research, is that the Americans are really always just looking for the sensational stories, very much looking for the way, focusing on the way Soviet authorities treat their dissidents, and then the Soviet publishers, they are just interested in the commercial aspects of the book trade. They want to actually learn how to do business with the American. So by the late 1970s, the biannual Moscow International Book Exhibition and Fair, and that is kind of an important change between 1975 and 1977, that they changed the name from just Moscow International Book Exhibition and add the word fair, indicating that it's a marketplace, that this is where rights are supposed to be negotiated. It's not just a display of literature anymore, but this is sort of showing that they are working on the book trade and sort of nurturing personal contacts across the Iron Curtain. And it's very interesting when you look behind the scene and you see that the fair became a kind of training ground for Soviet officials and publishers to acquire the language of book commerce that had not been used by the state publishing system previously. So they go in there with just this goal of learning from the Americans on how to do book business. The Americans are always, especially because they are held accountable both with several congressional hearings in the United States and of course the American media, like that they have to be careful in doing business with the Soviets, but they end up sort of both getting a little bit of what they want. So the first international book fair, the one that is focused on these rights in 1977, there was a lot of controversy. Like I said, the United States are worried about censorship, but they have this business interest. There was also a whole new market of readers, publishing books, more books than they could. And this was seen in many aspects of culture. There were musicians who also wanted to go to the Soviet Union to sort of make it over there because it was a new market that was almost untapped by Western artists and musicians and now book publishers. And the Soviet side is just focused on business. At the fair, we located these semi-diplomatic spaces, as we call them. I'll tell you a little bit more about them as we go along, because they established a business club where they provided the actual sort of back rooms for publishers to sit down and negotiate the rights. And the outcome was that there were about 80,000 books on display at this fair. There were about 160,000 visitors and 29,000 copies of English language paperbacks made it to the Soviet Union for the fair. And then, in the end, it was maybe a platform where some of the sensitive issues could be raised. At least they were raised quite a bit, like I said, in the American media, and the Soviets had to kind of deal with them in the both the confined space of the book fair, but then also in the semi-diplomatic spaces that were taking place in the sort of back rooms. So this is where this is a photo from one of the back rooms in 1977. Where we look at and now we're just actually looking at this transnational space that was created at the business club at the Moscow Book Fair. And here they are signing the deal to publish the Thornbirds in a Russian translation. So this is now, like Frankfurt in the West, the Frankfurt Book Fair, the Moscow International Book Fair has become mainly a rights fair. And the publication of the Thornbirds is really interesting, especially because we are, like I said, focusing on the time before Perestroika, and a lot of the literature has focused on how like Western bestsellers and romance literature was only sort of available, even late in Perestroika. Like 1988 is kind of a year that many people mention. It's the year that an American bookstore was opened in downtown Moscow as well. But there was definitely a legal publication of a book like The Thornbirds that did not have any ideological framing that was useful to the Soviet Union. So, of course, what they did is they had a sort of very strict ideological literature professor write an introduction that tried very much to sort of tell the Soviet readers how they were supposed to read this. So it is, of course, likely that the Soviet readers read the Thornbirds through a certain ideological lens, but it's interesting because there's no indication that the American publishers saw this Australian family saga as a part of a Western cultural campaign at the time. They were really just thinking about entering and opening up a potential new market for their authors. And so one of the arguments that we made is that before the onset of perestroika, I mean, these types of agreements, perfectly legal, on the table agreements, actually changed the possibilities for Western cultural consumption in the Soviet Union. And another global bestseller was published legally in the Soviet Union in 1982, and that was Gone with the Wind. So I mean, and it had taken that long, but I mean, and not many people, even in my field of Soviet history, are aware of this, like how much legal literature there actually was in the Soviet Union. So here is the Harper and Row cover from 1977, and the middle book that's the 1980, the first Soviet publication cover of the book. It was published in 50,000 copies in 1980, and by 1988 it was reprinted and published in 500,000 copies. And then it's a part of like the sort of influx of American literature to the Soviet Union. But we argue in this work that the book fairs opened the Soviet book market to Western bestsellers already by the late 1970s to the early 1980s. And there is, like there was with the economic imbalances, there's an imbalance in what the American publishers then want to publish from the Soviet Union, but we have not gotten to that part of the story just yet. So then when we get to the Cold War of the early 1980s, with Ronald Reagan entering into power after the war in Afghanistan, the Association of American Publishers withdraw from the 1981 and 1983 Moscow International Book Fairs, but despite such boycotts of official events, several independent American publishers continued to participate in the book fairs, partly because of commercial interests, and partly because of an idealist ambition in maintaining a dialogue with the Soviet Union. And what we saw is that by the early 1980s, there is a discourse of book hunger internalizing in Goskamistat, and they justify international publication relations, even under these dire circumstances, where now everything is almost completely closed. All the diplomatic channels are closed, and the book fair is no longer this open space that it was in 1977 and 1979. And they use all kinds of means to justify further publication relations. And that's when we have the concept of semi-diplomatic spaces that we used to show sort of the process of these continued publishing relations, going from the back rooms and these business clubs at the Moscow Book Fair to looking at the role of individual actors that were bypassing formal diplomatic channels, and also the role of print media. And that's one of the fun things about working with Birgitte and her focus on the book as a material object, is that we also sort of in book diplomacy, we also include journals and just printed materials as such. It's not just, the book as we know it, but we look at the book as a material object and textual space in these transnational information exchanges. And this is, I'll tell you, I think I have a little bit of time just to tell you a bit about it's an interesting story that caught our attention also shortly after the current, the invasion of Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Scientific American in Russian translation was canceled now, after the invasion in 2022. And it is actually quite interesting that it launched in Russia in the early 1980s. Like I said, after the invasion of Afghanistan, it was very similar to what we see today, is that the Soviet Union was very isolated. But only 3 years after this invasion, the editor of Scientific American, Gerard Piel, reached an agreement with the Soviet State Committee for Publishing, Gazkamistat, to publish a Russian language edition of the journal. And I'm not going to go in depth into the story, but it was really sort of, I mean, the way that it happened. I mean, they were both Gerard Pil and then Kapitsa, who is listed there. He was the future editor of the Russian translation and the son of the Nobel laureate physicist Pyotr Kapitsa. He had spent his childhood in Cambridge, Britain, where his father worked at the university and was fluent in English. So Kapitsa, both father and son, they knew Gerard Pil personally from their joint engagement in the Pokwas conferences on science and world affairs. That was the International Science Diplomatic Organization, initiated with the Russell-Einstein Manifesto in 1955 to curb nuclear proliferation and appeal to dialogue and peaceful resolutions of the Cold War conflict. So here, I mean, to begin with, it's just that they know each other personally that is really important. They were both recognized within their fields, and this long and personal acquaintance, mutual recognition, and respect proved crucial to overcome the obstacles to publish a Soviet edition of Scientific American in an atmosphere of very, very harsh relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. So Gerard Pil came to Moscow with his wife and met with Biesrotny, who was the head of the State Committee of Publishing, Gazkamistat. And, you know, the meetings were all bad, nothing worked. And then he was just, the Pils were at the hotel and were getting ready to leave. And then Biesrotny came to the hotel and surprised them because he had found a way to link the publication of the Russian language issue of Scientific American to the 1982 Soviet food program, which was supposed to improve the productivity and output of Soviet agriculture. So he went to his boss, he went to the Central Committee and, you know, said, okay, we have to fulfill this part of the food program, which is a part of the 5-year plan. And this can be a way for us to check a box. And it just flew through the system. So it was, you know, no problem to publish this American popular journal in Russian, just because it would sort of give them this, what they needed towards the authorities that were obviously not looking. Because, I mean, this created a venue for scientists to you know, read about, read this popular science magazine in Russian. And we have a longer sort of, in the article, this is in the new, in the book Diplomacy book. We also show how the first IBM computer that was brought to the Soviet Union plays a big role in terms of the layout and then also the typescript of this journal. And it's actually kind of fascinating that the computer had been sitting for months in a corner in the ministry and nobody knew how to use it. And that was also just through personal contacts and these semi-diplomatic channels that were created by people going into hotel rooms, or the American ambassador at the time also had some personal connections that he could use to actually teach them how to use the computer. And you see now the advertisement in the American edition of Scientific American. And all in all, information and information exchange is a huge sort of topic that we are dealing with here. So it was the launching of Brezhnev's 1982 Soviet food program that made then Andropov was the one who had to agree to it, but it was what led them to be able to sign an agreement on the Soviet, again, legal publication of Scientific American. And it's also a very interesting story in terms of the technology of the print and the typography, creating also what we call interesting transnational diplomatic spaces, with a main Soviet typographer working in New York at the United Nations. And so all of this goes through personal contacts. So finally now, just some conclusions about Soviet American book diplomacy. It's balancing it has to balance between the conflicting goals of the Helsinki Acts and information exchange and information access. And then we see the early Reagan years and the weakening status of the Soviet Union as an information power at the same time. Soviet-American book diplomacy unfolds in these semi-diplomatic spaces provided by Goskomistad, paving way for interrelations between state publishers and business partners that are then the private publishers on the American side and the diplomatic level. And then Soviet-American book diplomacy finds unexpected ways, such as legitimizing an American publication by linking it to the Soviet food program. So it often appears as backdoor diplomacy, and it is mediated by physical publications and information technology, such as the arrival of the IBM computer in the Soviet Union. So it was not just the books and magazines themselves that were carriers of ideological content. Also their look and layout serve as diplomatic messengers in the overall story. So I think I'm going to stop here. We can continue the conversation.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, okay. Our three speakers have not only delivered inspiring presentations, but they have also been very disciplined and have kept to the time limit. So now we have some time for this discussing their presentations, and don't be shy. I'm sure they are very happy to reply and address your questions. Anyone wants to start?
You can ask also in Espanol if you
And
feel
you can
more
also make
comfortable.
comments. The presentation, the speakers, if you wanna. Oscar, let's see. Luis.
Okay. Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I found them very interesting and very insightful in many ways. I have three questions, one for each speaker, and but somehow you can answer. All of you can answer the questions because they are somehow related to your presentations. The first one is in relation to the programs that you were describing, Andrés, because we are talking about books, but books are written in a language. And I think the linguistic point, should be considered, and I guess it's important to understand many things. First of all, in terms of a common language, you mentioned that when you were talking about the Castilian translations, as I understand, because obviously the Castilian Spanish is the standard, the prestigious standard version of Spanish. So I guess that we're more prestigious in Latin America for this reason, as I understood. But what I'm trying to say is that I don't know if all these programs were focused on translations, or somehow they try to promote a kind of linguistic imperialism using this concept from Tilson when he talked about the British Council and the promotion of books by libraries in different former British colonies. I don't know if there is something like that, because I think, for example, in this the Summer Institute of Linguistics and this the Bible project, when they try to promote indigenous languages in Latin America, and it was a way to promote religious ideas among some people that probably were not able to speak Spanish or to read Spanish. So I guess it's somehow important to look at this point. So I wanted to ask you about that. In relation to Pablo's speech, I really like what you said, and the article that you wrote. I would like to read it. But I would like to ask you about the fake editions, because in Latin America, we have we used to have so many counterfeit books, these kind of books that were sometimes even very bad editions. I mean, like it's sometimes there were translations that were very bad, and but they were very cheap. And I think many Spanish publishers, particularly in the beginning of the 20th century, were complaining about this because it was a kind of competition that was quite unfair. And I don't know if these kind of editions were somehow undermining these programs, these US programs. For Rósa, just a question about the exhibitions and book fairs, because I really like what you said about the change from book exhibitions to book fairs, and you describe the book fairs as marketplaces. And my question is, if I understand, what you try to mean is that these marketplaces also apply some, say, corporate strategies or commercial strategies. So should we talk about nation branding rather than cultural diplomacy? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis.
Please, thank you for your insightful questions. You raised a very interesting point about linguistics. To be honest, I think in the sources that we have seen, which are, as Pablo explained, in our research, mostly American and Spanish sources, we haven't found much reference to the question of indigenous languages. But I think you raised a very interesting point, and I'm looking forward to researching more on that. On the question of the Spanish language as such, though, one of the things that I found was very interesting is, as you said, there was a great focus on translation as one of the main problems, because from the point of view of US Cold Warriors, they thought that there wasn't so much good information or so many good books in Spanish. So one of the things that when they spoke of the book gap, they sometimes meant that it was a kind of a Spanish book gap, in the sense that the books were there, but they were in English. That was the problem. There wasn't enough books. There were no books in Spanish. In relation to that, if I may say something about fake editions and piracy, that was certainly that we have found that there was certainly a lot of concern. Obviously, you have also looked into that from the point of view of Spanish publishers. Certainly, still in the 50s, there were certain countries that were particularly. In the case of Argentina, there were many complaints about Uruguay as a kind of piracy hub, shall we say, because in particular in relation to the Argentine market, right? But clearly, certainly, as far as we have seen, Americans were not particularly concerned about that, about the problem of piracy. That was something that was logically more of a concern for corporations like Spanish publishers, not so much, at least in the sources we have found, for US diplomats. And I think this goes back to the question of what the goals were, right? In the sense that the problem was lack of materials in Spanish, piracy wasn't so much of an issue for Cold Warriors. But as I said, as long, of course, as the books being copied or being fake were the right ones, right? So in relation, another additional thing I want to say on linguistics, you mentioned the question of Castilian Spanish as being the kind of prestigious version of, or the most prestigious Spanish. And this also goes back to the question of the knowledge that they are looking to transfer. And this is particularly more in relation to technical books, but there was this perception among US Cold Warriors that not only there were not enough materials in Spanish, but there was an assumption that somehow Spanish language culture was not sophisticated enough. That this went back to, again, perceptions about Spanish colonization, the Black Day, and all those things, and this notion that it wasn't just a language question, a question of lack of materials. That was certainly, they thought that was an issue, but there was also this idea that we need to change Spanish culture because Spanish culture is not scientific enough or not technical enough. And that's also a reason why they don't have so many technical materials in Spanish.
Don't have much to add, but one point is that the Americans thought that the Soviets didn't had a market purpose, right? They didn't want to profit economically. They were doing propaganda. So everything was available, every route was pursued on that side. So the Americans needed to compete when trying to target mass audience with cheap books. And cheap books had to be translated. So that's why the most popular programs were always translation programs. And not only for Spain, but almost all around the world. Books in English, when targeted to Spain or to many other countries, were usually targeting the elites, the professional elites, which was also an important thing to do. But large programs like the one we've talked about, that required translation because price was key.
If I may add another thing, this is still because this summer I was in the Mexican archives. One thing about looking about the Alliance for Progress, and this still is something, these are records that are still in processing. But one thing that, in relation to this, that I found very interesting is that we mentioned there are very few books in the Alboreal collection, Pablo mentioned, were actually about the Alliance for Progress. But I think something that is very interesting is that there were, in Spanish, there were very few titles on the Alliance for Progress, but in English, there were many more titles available on the Alliance for Progress.
that were promoted by other agencies and institutions, and apparently there wasn't any interest in translating those books, those specific. There were many titles on the Alliance for Progress and Latin American in the 60s in English, and they were apparently never translated into Spanish.
Yeah, this is very interesting for me. I mean, I didn't know very much about the Latin American book market, and I certainly didn't know about this program. So, and the counterfeit books, I mean, it is kind of reminding me of just the Soviet environment, you know, where nobody's negotiating for any rights, nobody's really getting paid for anything. And then the language question I thought also was thought-provoking for me, because progress publishers in the Soviet Union always published books in the original language as well. So there were a lot of books published by Soviet, progress publishers in English, in Spanish, in other languages. They were not very attractive, and they did not get distributed very far. They were often very peculiar, but the language definitely matters. And I thought that I, also started thinking about, because you mentioned, linguistic and how the language matters, how often during the Cold War, the abridged version, I mean, if we think about Reader's Digest or, all these Soviet publications, also in Spanish, in French, in English, they were always condensed and sort of, not showing the original aestheticness of the text, but just the, abridged version, and the Americans did exactly the same thing. So I thought that was interesting. But your question about the fairs, I mean, I would say if the fairs as a marketplace are more like would fall more under the label of nation branding rather than cultural diplomacy, I mean, no matter how we label it, it's definitely what they're doing. I mean, the whole Cold War, I mean, the competing aspect, I mean, it's about competing modernities. So we have the space race, and we have books, and we have, industrialization of the Soviet Union, and then we have culture and ballet and everything. It is always about saying, look, we are better. The conditions for, practicing an instrument and becoming great are much better in the Soviet Union than they are in the capitalist system. And that becomes an element of, what we now can call nation branding or place branding, because it's always about selling socialism as an idea. So of course, when they start, and Moscow, I mean, the history of book fairs is of course really interesting with, Frankfurt versus Leipzig in Europe, and then we have Moscow branding itself, as an international marketplace, but it is, like you rightly point out, it is very much also, look at us, look at how well we're now doing, look at how we've moved from, talking about books as weapons to books as an instrument of peace, and we are participating in international dialogue. So definitely it's always about, see us, see what we're doing, the Soviet Union is, and the superiorness of their way of life.
Rósa, I was very much interested in the concept of semi-diplomatic spaces, and also on the proactivity of these players that you exemplified with the journal case, because it reminds me of how a small cultural corporation in Spain, in a peripheral country for the Cold War, was calling to the door of the USA and saying, okay, here I am, I'm at your service, let's do business together. I have contacts with the Cámara Cubana del Libro as well, if you are interested. I mean, they were, it was not only the state players, there were other people trying to play a role for self-interest of whatever level or dimension. So I think it's interesting, the connections.
Absolutely. And I was going to ask you a question about Plaza. When you said that, I mean, are there any examples of conflicts between Plaza and USIA over, I mean, I know that the USIA always had the last word in choosing the materials, but sometimes did you see like any kind of new sort of tension between them in choosing the titles, or was it just?
Not really. We haven't seen that on the records, though. I mean, of course, Plaza had made a safe bet because they had a sure a profit per title. But they were all, of course, interested in selling as much books as possible, because after all, they were running a business, right? So I guess that the more books, the more interesting the books, the better for them, commercially speaking. So for me, it's sort of surprising that there is not more of a pushback or of a dialogue, like saying, you know, these books are not going to work, because I can suspect that many people involved, including those at USAA, suspected that that was not going to work, because it hadn't worked before. But also we have to think of the American system. This is a democracy. They have pressure, bureaucratic pressure. The Congress is watching. So maybe you prefer to opt for these books, but then someone in Congress is going to complain, and we'll go back to the McCarthy days when book programs were very much being watched by Congress. It was difficult for everyone involved to make the right decisions from a propaganda point of view. And the fact that the Spanish company couldn't really do much but decide from a list that was given to them, I mean, it was either that or not getting the money. Well, I get the money, and then I try to do as best as I can with the list you are providing me, which is probably not the best list, even from American cultural workers' point of view. But of course, they were being watched by Congress, by the administration, by the State Department. They were competing with the USAID, bureaucratically speaking. I mean, it was much more complex. It was a very complex operation to be successful, I think.
If I may ask,
sure.
The most serious conflict we have seen is, again, related to copyright, because several titles apparently blatantly pay the copyright to the American publishers for the translation. The American publishers complained, and then the USAA paid the copyright after the fact, apparently. Yes, as also the Prime Minister has pointed out in relation to what Pablo said, in the 50s they had huge problems with some of the authors included because of McCarthy and all that. So I think even though in the 60s on other realms there is this kind of idea of rapprochement with the left, I think they were trying to be very cautious.
Too cautious, probably.
I think that Lola wanted to say something, to ask something.
Yes, it's a small question. One is for Rose. Do you think that it exists a continuity between the book exhibitions on that age and the book exhibitions today, or perhaps they have very different purpose? And second, a very small, perhaps silly question, just a curiosity for you. Why do you include Jules Verne and William Shakespeare on Soviet book diplomacy? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so the Russians definitely market them as a continuation, these book exhibits, but I mean, and it was definitely not any kind of linear process. I mean, some of the key players on the American side, from the American Association of Publishers, did not always get a visa. Like Bernstein was there in '77, he did not make it over in '79 because he didn't get a visa. So it was never completely sort of an open space. I mean, there were always obstacles. And then I haven't followed it. I've only seen what's been written online about the contemporary book exhibits in Russia, but they've gone back to being completely closed. I mean, there's not very much, international now has a different definition. It was Communist International in 1967. It was rather international in the late 1970s, and then it sort of got back and forth again in the 1980s, and now I think it's more people who or countries that align with Russia. Western countries are no longer participating at all. And I mean, it is kind of interesting in this context. I mean, especially with sort of the similarity with the post-Afghanistan situation, where there are economic sanctions on the Soviet Union, and I mean that they actually managed to make these kinds of negotiations and contracts, because post-2022 you can't do it. I mean, Scientific American is no longer published. There's no longer a cultural exchange agreement between Russia and the United States, all of which survived the Cold War, which is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yes. Clarify. Yes, I include that ranking as not necessarily an example per se of Soviet diplomacy as such, but as what was the perception of the Americans about Soviet diplomacy. So there were obviously Soviet authors, but also Western authors. But there was this idea that from the American point of view, Soviet authors were more read or were more prominent because they sold more books, and they found that like very threatening, that like this idea of Karl Marx selling more books than Jules Verne. So that was sorry, I might be confusing, but my point was that not so much the reality of Soviet diplomacy as the American perception of Soviet books are everywhere.
I thought that you are defending that William Shakespeare fight my Soviet ideas.
No.
It's a Soviet spy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that Nuria wanted to,
Yes.
and after your comments, we will have to close the session. No, after. No.
So thank you very much. As an economic historian, I always enjoy meeting true historians, and you haven't disappointed me. It's been a feast. So a narrow and self-interested question for the of you. Did you come across school books, including children and youth books? Because this was, well, it's a field that you are interested in, but this was the fast growing section within the publishing industry.
Rósa, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I wish Birgitte was here, because she is the expert and actually working on children and youth books, both during Soviet times and now today. She has a project on Ukrainian children's books being published now. So I would definitely, if you're interested, you can look up some of her work for sure. But I have also looked at some textbook initiatives. And there are projects that were initiated between the Soviet and American government as a part of the whole cultural relations, cultural diplomacy sector that deal with going through textbooks. So American historians went through textbooks of went through Soviet textbooks and vice versa. And they wrote reports about it, but nothing really came out of it, although the reports are interesting. I mean, from also, if you're interested in like historical education and ideology and these kinds of, and then there were delegations and groups that were meeting to discuss these kinds of things. But I have not seen anything about them, publishing en masse textbooks, American textbooks in the Soviet Union for sure not, but some maybe some of these cooperative projects. But we have thought about including textbooks and children's books because we have kind of now gone the genre direction, so the bestseller genre and the science literature genre, and we have been considering looking more into that.
Yeah, as far as textbooks, what we have seen in relation to one of these agencies from one of the programs from USAID, which is the Regional Technical Aid Centers. They, as far as we know, I haven't seen anything about primary or secondary education, but they were very interested in university textbooks. and they certainly did try, as far as we know, change the textbooks used at certain Latin American universities, and in particular, their interpretation was that Latin American universities in the 60s, at least 50s and 60s, the problem was that there were many textbooks at all, because according to their analysis, Latin American universities relied on lectures and the notes that students took from lectures, and they didn't use textbooks. And the first thing to do was introducing textbooks as such. And again, according to them, they were extremely successful when the program was terminated in the late 70s. They terminated the program because it was so successful. Of course, the problem with this kind of assessment is that I don't think how reliable that is. But yes, we have found that they were interested in university textbooks. But we haven't found references so far to secondary and primary education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yes. Okay. The very last question for Lorenzo.
It's not a question.
It's a comment.
Thank you very much for this session of the seminar. But I have to remember that we are in 2 minutes to fly to the moon. We are a visit to the exhibition in the floor.
Okay, yes, you are completely right. So I'm sorry to cut short the seminar here. We can continue with this stimulating conversation over lunch. And yes, let's go to see the moon, the exhibition. I'm sure that Lorenzo and Pablo are going to be very glad to guide us through the exhibition. And thank you. It's been very interesting seminar.